In 1922, at the age of 12, a man named Clarence Jordan made his profession of faith at a Baptist tent revival in South Georgia. The very next night, he was startled awake by an agonizing sound coming from the prison yard located next to his childhood home. Clarence's bedroom window provided clear view of a black man being tortured. Clarence quickly realized that the tormentor, the prison warden, was the same person who had been leading Love Lifted Me the night before. That experience changed his life forever. Clarence never tired of saying, God is not so much interested in our talk as in our walk. The way that we live matters far more than the pretentious rhetoric of our religious piety. Like the prophets Amos and Micah and Isaiah who preached long before him, Clarence believed that God was disgusted by the religious ritual that does not lead to Christian action. His life is a testimony of someone who fully carried his cross, letting Christ's light shine for the world to see. He was inspired by the radical message of the Sermon on the Mount and became a biblical scholar who dedicated his life to translating the Greek New Testament into the plain spoken language and physical context of the rural South Georgia. It's a very interesting place. Like Jerusalem is now Atlanta, and he was born in Macon, so he put it all in the south, and he kind of changed some of the names. Instead of Judas, it's Judd, putting it in context. The name of this Bible, you may have heard of the play called Cotton Patch Gospel. It's an interesting translation. In 1942, instead of using his many gifts to become a pastor of a large, well-to-do church, or using his PhD to secure a seminary professorship, Clarence and his wife Florence founded an intentional, inclusive Christian community near his home in Sumter, Georgia. The community was named after the Greek word for community or fellowship, koinonia. The community is called Koinonia Community or Koinonia Farm. Koinonia Farm organized their communal life around clearly defined biblical values and ideals. Covenant members chose to live, work, and worship together and shared all their worldly possessions. They even kept a common purse. Koinonia has been a powerful witness of New Testament living since 1942, challenging racial and economic inequalities of its manifestations. So here, watch this short little introduction to a documentary about Koinonia Farm.
We knew exactly what we were getting into when we came.
This was a group that we did not know. They had a philosophy that was not familiar to the local people. They were called Nicholas, all the colors.
Oh, it was an evil place.
You will read things like Reverend George, he ain't nothing but an agitator.
What was happening at Koinonia was happening in a vacuum. It was the backwater of the civil rights movement, and it still doesn't have its place in history, and I don't suppose it ever will.
That was Koinonia, a kind of a beacon light for people who believe in racial equality.
There's a simple farm in South Georgia where racism and religion once collided. How ironic that this place that embraces love, tolerance, and sharing could also be a place that has spawned fear, hatred, and violence.
Being an integrated community in the South in the 1940s, 50s was not an easy journey for them. Perhaps most notably today, Koinonia Farm is credited with giving birth to the international home building organization called Habitat for Humanity. Miller Ford, the founder of Habitat for Humanity, was a member of Koinonia Farm. He says that Clarence Jordan is the grandfather of Habitat for Humanity. Clarence believed Jesus and devoted his life to proving him right. A few months before his death in 1969, someone asked Clarence what he would say to the Lord if he came down and said, "Clarence, give me in 5 minutes, tell me everything that you've done." Clarence responded in his deep southern drawl, "I'd tell the Lord to come back when he had more time." Today in the gospel, Jesus gathers a crowd and plainly delivers his message in Mark. "If any want to follow me," Jesus said, "let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who lose their life, those who want to save their life will lose it, but those who are willing to lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." This is not an easy message for us to hear in the church, much less the world that would rather make a commitment that doesn't demand much and doesn't take much time. In fact, we'd much rather hear about a heavenly life to come, a place where every care is taken care of, and a place somewhere out there with pearly gates and golden streets. What most of us want for ourselves and for our children is not sacrifice at all, but comfort. What we want is to be happy. Someone once said that most people come to church as consumers, picking and choosing their spirituality. As a result, the church becomes for them like a supermarket of desire. And when they have no external source of authority, nothing to stand against our ego, there is no check against our tendencies towards deceit and self-deception. We all want to be happy. When Jesus talks about denying ourselves and letting go of control, resisting evil and turning the other cheek, or going the extra mile, or sharing one another's burden, and today we hear, "Take up your cross for the sake of God's kingdom," we hear all this stuff about following the way of Jesus, and it scares us. We say, "But that's really just not realistic. If only the world worked that way, it would be nice." Because everything else in their culture warns against a life of such risk and uncertainty. We're taught to avoid controversy at all costs. We've been taught from the cradle to pursue a life that leads to security and happiness, which sometimes conflicts with faithfulness. Security is the opposite of sacrifice, and security is often ambivalent to justice for all. Steve Garnis at Holmes said the cross in Jesus' day was not a logo or a metaphor or jewelry. The cross was an instrument of pain and shame, absolute loss and death. It was a real weapon. The only way to take it up was to become its victim. When Jesus picked up his cross, it was set against the Roman Empire and the temple authorities, against an ideology of the world that oppressed and shackled God's people, and against everything that hindered the inbreaking of God's kingdom to come here on earth. He picked up the cross to literally go to his death. This passage about the cross-bearing reminds me of a story I heard many years ago from Reverend Robert Baggett. He shared in his own sermon. He said that a clergy friend told him that his grandfather knew a lot about crosses. What seemed to start off as a joke certainly didn't end as a joke. When he asked what it meant by that, he said, no, literally, back in the 1950s, his grandfather was a grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And more than one occasion, his grandfather had led other men in burning crosses in public property and in private lawns. What motivated such a use of this cross in this way? Kenneth Jackson, in his Ku Klux Klan in the City book, says virtually every Protestant denomination denounced the Ku Klux Klan, but what most Ku Klux Klan members were not anxious about that and did not think that they were doing was immoral or subverted American institutions, but rather they saw their membership in keeping with 100% Americanism and Christian morality. The goal of the Klan included an intent to reestablish Protestant Christian values in America by any means possible. These white supremacists terrorized Catholics, Jews, and blacks with arson, beating, destruction of property, lynching, rape, murder, tar and feathering, whipping, intimidation through such means as burning crosses. They claimed that they were upholding the Protestant Christian values of America. Klansmen conducted cross burnings not only to intimidate people, but also to demonstrate their respect and reverence for Jesus Christ. The rituals of lighting the cross were steeped in Christian symbolism. Thus, Klan members would light the cross during meetings, and it was often accompanied by a prayer, a sharing in Christian hymns, and other overtly religious symbolism. But today we clearly know it was motivated by hatred, prejudice, animosity, and hostility, and bitterness, and ignorance. The rise of Christian nationalism today is a revival of much of this thought, and it is deeply concerning. Reverend Baggett said his friend shared that the hatred was the driving force in his grandfather's life, but he does not speak much about this horrific period in his family's life. In fact, only a few of his friends really know of its existence at all. Reverend Baggett said that one day he had the courage to ask his friend about how he reconciled this portion of his life and his family history. His friend smiled and said quietly, "Well, you see, my grandfather went through a conversion experience in midlife, and the cross began to play a very different role for him. It had been for him an emblem by which he spewed hatred. But one day, my grandfather said, as the stories of the scriptures were read in his church, he heard the line about taking up his cross and realized that every cross that he had picked up to that point had been misused. And so his grandfather said he knelt and prayed for a little guidance on the matter, and God showed him what to do with his cross. He says, my grandfather said he nailed his rage and prejudice upon the cross and let it die there. With that death, something new came to life in him. Then he went on to say that decision made all the difference in his grandfather's life, which was clear from what happens later in his life. This clergy person, whose grandfather had once been the Grand Wizard of the clan, but found redemption in the cross, that clergy person went back to his grandfather's hometown after being invited to come play at a golf fundraiser. He shared that a green van from the golf club picked him up from the airport along with several of his friends. The driver of the van introduced himself as Carleton. He picked up the golf bag and the luggage and then drove off to the golf course. Driving through his grandfather's hometown, he said he told his friends about all the places of his family's history, not the KKK part, but the rest of the story. He even pointed out in the downtown block where his grandfather owned a loan company and a pawn shop for many years. He went on and he said, when we arrived at the golf club, Carleton, the driver, walked around the back of the van and began to unload everyone's bag. One by one, my golfing buddies walked away until I was the only one left at the van with the driver. When Carleton handed me my bag, he said, I knew your grandfather. His heart sunk. Thoughts flew through his head, thinking, here it goes. I'm going to a golf club and this black man is handing me my suitcase, and he knew my grandfather. Here it comes. He was just waiting for some horrific story. But Carleton said, I knew your grandfather. In fact, after your grandfather's conversion, he was a changed man. If it weren't for him, many of my people in town would have gone hungry. He was always willing to give you money if you needed a loan, and sometimes he even loaned it to you with no interest if you were really hard up. He was a good Christian man, and you should be proud. Now, isn't that something? From grand wizard to humble Christian with a servant's heart. Out of death comes new life. Out of a way of death comes new life. Maybe Jesus was right, and his yoke is really easy, and his burden light. In bearing the cross, we will find hardship, but sweet souls of rest. I wonder if Archbishop Tutu, I know, laughed more than most of us. I wonder if Nelson Mandela slept better than us. Because Jesus may be right, and those of us who are rushing around trying to make our lives more comfortable, seeking happiness that doesn't make us happy, may be missing something far more essential and more important. I'm not sure how much the typical cross weighs these days, but I know it's about 10 times less than the weight of self-centeredness and arrogance. I'm not sure how much the cross weighs, but I know that it's less costly than injustice and oppression. The courage to do what is right, no doubt, carries a price, but it's a whole lot cheaper than the guilt and regret that will come afterwards. That's something you know. What the church, what the body of Christ needs most urgently today is not more people or more money or more programs or more ministries, and we certainly don't need more buildings. What the church needs today more than anything else is courage. We simply need more courage. We need more courage to follow the way of Christ. By and large, we're afraid to risk, and we are even afraid of those who ask us to risk. In a culture that seeks, above all, to soothe and protect, while everywhere else are woefully overstressed, overworked, overweight, and overmedicated, I think the cross of Jesus may be actually lighter than the other stuff that we're trying to carry instead. And I think the radical way of Jesus has its advantages over the other roads that we've been on, which most of them have been dead ends. Today in Georgia, just up the road from Koinonia Farm, on your way to Americus, you can still see a pretty white-framed Southern Baptist church that is best known for disfellowshipping Clarence Jordan and his family for their commitment to racial justice and economic sharing. I heard a story while I was visiting Koinonia Farm that whenever the congregation met in the 1950s to consider the motion to kick Clarence and his wife Florence out of the church, Florence attended the spiteful meeting even though Clarence was out of town at a speaking engagement. In fact, she not only attended the meeting, she sat on the front row, and when the motion was made to disfellowship the entire Jordan family because of their work to promote racial integration and equality, Florence Jordan raised her hand and seconded the motion. She got up and said, if the crime was loving their neighbor and working to protect their God-given human rights, she said that we are guilty as charged. Sometimes that's what it looks like to carry a cross. Sometimes that's the kind of courage that's required of us, and also the kind of peace that sweeps over us whenever we do seek to follow the way of Christ. If any want to become my followers, Jesus said, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. The cross is no longer utilized as the Romans did in Jesus' day to execute insurrectionists. Today, maybe we could understand the cross as the place of our transformation. A place to hang our arrogance, our rage, our bitterness, our prejudice, our greed, our addictions. Hang whatever it is that's keeping you from fully following Christ, being the person God's called you to be. Hang those things on the cross and let them die, so that something more eternally good and grace-filled and Christ-like may be born and resurrected. Being who God has called you to be will bring fulfillment and happiness we are all seeking. Think of the hundreds and thousands of Christians who have trusted in the power of the cross to bring about change, no matter if the change was a personal situation, a social condition, a political injustice, or a national disgrace. But make no mistake, such cross-bearing will often carry a heavy load as they pick up their cross to follow Jesus. But they've done it over and over again because they are sure of the potential and the power of the cross to burst into the world when Jesus first shouldered it, is now accessible to every Christian today. The cross is now our method of grasping and enlisting the transforming power capable of bringing God's kingdom more fully present among us today. May it be so for you this day. Amen. And now let us go to God as we sing our hymn of response.